They're locking weapons. Let them. Captain Torin Vex's voice was ice over a battlefield. No hesitation, no fear. Just the certainty of a man who already knew the outcome. On the Black Serpent's command deck, laser plasma displays flickered with shifting threat markers, Concord warships converging like a pack of predators on wounded prey. Except they weren't the hunters, they were the ones walking into a trap. Incoming hail from the Vralic Ascendancy, sir, demanding surrender. Torin exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. Surrender? The irony nearly made him laugh. The Galactic Concord, an empire spanning 1,000 systems, still believed humanity was weak. That Earth had just stumbled into the stars, clutching crude weapons and wide-eyed wonder. That their place was beneath the boot of those who belonged here, the fools. "Return the hail," Torin said, voice steady. The command deck fell into a hushed, expectant silence as the heads-up display flickered. An alien visage appeared, Admiral Zyrol Vexer, all gleaming chitin and swollen arrogance, speaking from the bridge of his flagship. "Primitive vessel," Zyrol sneered, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "You have trespassed in forbidden space. Your kind is unfit for interstellar warfare. Surrender, and your world will be given a place as a Concord servitor state. Refuse, and we will show you why your species was exiled from the stars." Torin didn't blink. He didn't move. The silence stretched just long enough for the chill to set in. Then he leaned forward. "Admiral," he said, tone razor-edged, "I'm not here to fight your war." Zyrol's mandibles twitched in confusion. "I'm here to end it." He flicked his fingers, a subtle gesture. The Black Serpent answered. The first railgun round left the chamber at nearly a fraction of light speed, a hyperdense slug of depleted tungsten and sheer planetary rage. There was no flash of energy or drawn-out buildup, just a sudden absence where an enemy vessel had been. The Vralic Ascendancy's escort ship was erased from reality, its hull ripped apart in an instant, debris scattering like dust in a solar wind. "Direct hit!" Lieutenant Marin Dax called out, his fingers moving over the targeting interface. "Enemy shields didn't even register the impact." Of course they didn't. The Concord built their defenses against energy-based warfare, against predictable species who fought with lasers, plasma, and slow-burning attrition. They had no counter for a kinetic nightmare moving faster than they could comprehend. "Admiral," Torin murmured, watching the Concord flagship's shields flare uselessly, "if you have a god, now would be the time to pray." Zyrol's expression turned to pure disbelief. The battlefield erupted. The first wave of Concord ships closed in, unleashing a storm of plasma fire. The Black Serpent didn't flinch. It moved like a predator stalking in the dark, angling between the blasts, twisting through the chaos. "Fire at will," Torin ordered. The next barrage of railgun rounds shattered another warship's core, sending shockwaves through the fleet formation. Enemy officers barked frantic orders, trying to reposition, but the Serpent was already gone, weaving between debris fields and burning wreckage. Across the bridge, Commander Elias Kor folded his arms, watching the chaos unfold on the displays. "They still think they can win," he mused, voice edged with amusement. "Admirable. Stupid, but admirable." Torin's lips curled. "Let them think. The dead don't get time to regret their choices." More railgun slugs tore through the conquered fleet. Ships that had once lorded over lesser civilizations were reduced to tumbling, burning wreckage. The Black Serpent punched through their formations with the grace of a scalpel and the fury of an avalanche. "Ascendancy's reactors are destabilizing," Marin shouted. "We need to pull back before—" The Concord flagship detonated. A titanic explosion ripped through the darkness, a wave of heat and debris cascading outward. The wreckage caught two nearby ships in the blast radius, their hulls shearing apart under the force of their own leader's demise. The Black Serpent coasted effortlessly through the wreckage field, a lone shadow in the wake of destruction. On the bridge, the silence was absolute. Torin leaned back, exhaling. The battle was over before it had even begun, but he wasn't done. "Patch me through to Concord High Command," he said. Elias arched an eyebrow. Making friends? Torin's smile was slow, dark. Not quite. Minutes later, the transmission connected. The Galactic Concord's ruling chamber flickered onto the laser plasma display. A half-dozen alien warlords, advisors, and Overlord Clythe himself, sitting atop his towering obsidian throne, his amber eyes burning with disbelief. "Who are you?" Clythe demanded. Torin stood, taking a slow step forward. The lighting cast him in shadow, the glow of burning wreckage flickering in his pupils. "My name," he said, "is Captain Torin Vex. Remember it. You'll be saying it often." The council murmured, exchanging uneasy glances. "You believe this means anything?" Clythe's voice was an edged whisper, barely restrained fury. "A single warship? A minor skirmish? You think you can threaten the Galactic Concord?" Torin tilted his head slightly. "Threaten?" He let the word linger, let the moment stretch. Then he shook his head. "No, Overlord." He leaned in closer to the display, voice dropping into something almost gentle. "This isn't a threat." A single pause. "This is your final warning." Then he cut the feed. The command deck remained silent for several long seconds. Then Elias let out a low exhale, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, that'll piss them off." Torin smiled, watching the remnants of the Concorde fleet burn against the black. "Good." He turned back toward his chair, settling in. "Let's see what they do next." The scent of burnt circuits and scorched alloy clung to the command deck like a warning. The remnants of the Vralic ascendancy still smoldered in the void behind them, fractured hulls tumbling through the wreckage of what had once been an armada. Smoke and static rippled through the laser plasma displays, feeding live data into the Black Serpent's control systems. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. Torin Vex sat motionless in his command chair, his eyes tracing the unstable warp signatures left behind by fleeing Concord ships. They had run, some crippled, others intact, but reeling, and that was the point. Fear was more useful than eradication. A corpse told no tales, but a terrified survivor carried a legend. Elias Core studied the screen, arms crossed. His gaze was steady, though something in his stance suggested calculation. "They'll be rallying every fleet within range." His voice was smooth, calm, but beneath it ran a current of expectation. "They'll hesitate first," Torin countered, his fingers drumming once against the armrest. "They don't understand what just happened. They weren't expecting to lose, and they weren't expecting to lose this fast." "That won't last," Elias murmured. "No, it wouldn't. That was the nature of empires. First came the disbelief, then the rage. And soon, the conquered would turn that rage into action." A low ping echoed from the heads-up display. The external scanners were tracking new energy signatures, not reinforcements, not yet. Just the scattered remnants of what remained, stragglers, wounded prey. Marin Dax, the weapons officer, exhaled sharply. "Should we clean up?" Torin let the question hang in the air, watching the wreckage drift. The fractured halves of the Vralic ascendancy flickered against the void, emergency lights pulsing weakly in the dark, a fading heartbeat. Bodies, what remained of them, floated in the wreckage, some still clinging to shredded bulkheads, their suits leaking frozen streams of oxygen into the abyss. "The ones that can still move will spread the message faster than we ever could," Torin said finally. "Leave them." Elias's mouth twitched slightly. "Merciful." Torin's expression didn't shift. "Efficient." Marin gave a low chuckle, shaking his head as he turned back to his console. "Cold, Captain. Real cold." Torin didn't respond. He didn't need to. A new transmission request flickered on the laser plasma display. The source was encrypted, but Torin recognized the frequency. "Put it through," he ordered. The display shifted, resolving into a grainy, green-tinted feed. A dimly lit chamber appeared, built from curved stone and dark alloys, the interior of a bunker hidden beneath one of Earth's off-world colonies. A man stood at the center, his face half-shadowed, fatigue lining the sharp angles of his features. "Captain Vex," the voice was clipped, urgent. "We've intercepted Concord transmissions. They're moving faster than we projected." Torin's gaze sharpened. "How fast?" A flicker of static. "They've already begun mobilizing 4 fleets to surround the Sol system." Elias let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against his arm. "We expected retaliation, but they're cutting out the posturing phase. No time wasted on diplomatic threats or ultimatums." Torin exhaled through his nose, considering. The Concord didn't want a war. They wanted an execution, and they wanted it fast. Projected arrival? 72 hours for the first wave. If they coordinate their jump routes, they could have a full blockade in less than a week. Marin gave a low whistle. "That's not just a crackdown. That's extermination doctrine." The man on the transmission didn't disagree. "They think you're a rogue element, Vex, a ghost ship. But if they learn the truth, that the Black Serpent is just the beginning—" "They won't," Torin cut in. His voice was absolute. Elias met his gaze, silent understanding passing between them. The Black Serpent had done its job. It had whispered the first fracture of fear into the minds of the Concord. But now, the next step had to be executed perfectly. "We'll be ready," Torin said, ending the transmission. The bridge remained silent for a beat. The weight of the next 72 hours pressed against the air. Elias finally broke it. "We need to talk strategy." Torin stood, rolling his shoulders as he exhaled. "Marin, I want sensor sweeps along the perimeter. If any scouts slip past our blind spots, I want to know before they do." "Aye, Captain." "Elias, get me an operational assessment. We'll need to play this smarter than we did with the Ascendancy." Elias nodded. "We'll need misdirection. Let them think we're concentrated in one location while we prepare to strike elsewhere." Torin smirked. "You read my mind," Marin muttered under his breath. "Wouldn't be the first time." Torin ignored him. The crew dispersed to their stations, the atmosphere shifting from post-battle aftermath to calculated preparation. Torin turned back to the heads-up display, watching the ghostly echoes of the ruined fleet behind them. He could almost hear the Concord's reaction playing out across the distant war councils. Disbelief, fury, retaliation. Let them come. He tapped a control on the panel, switching the display to a live feed of Earth. It sat suspended in the black, a blue-lit titan of a world, its gravity heavier, its storms stronger, its terrain more unforgiving than anything the Conquered had ever conquered. They didn't understand what they were marching toward. He wondered how long it would take before they realized they were walking into the jaws of something they could never tame. "Captain," Elias called, "we've got movement." Torin turned back toward the main display, eyes narrowing. The Conquered wasn't wasting time. The second battle would be here sooner than expected. Good. The Serpent was hungry. "We have movement." Elias Corr's voice was level, but something coiled beneath it, something sharp. The heads-up display flickered, casting a spectral glow across the command deck as incoming data scrawled across the screen. Torin Vex leaned forward, scanning the tactical overlay. The Concord was moving faster than expected. Not a singular armada, not a cautious response. A coordinated strike force was already closing in. "They're splitting into 4 assault formations," Elias noted, his fingers gliding over the interface. 2 fleets closing from the outer rim, 1 from the inner core, and... He exhaled slowly. 1 direct to Sol. Torin didn't react, didn't flinch. The Concorde was done with words. This was a killing stroke, meant to sever Earth's throat before it had a chance to scream. "Status on the Serpent?" Jackson Holt, standing over the engineering station, didn't look up as he answered. "We've rerouted power to the forward shield lattice, railgun capacitors at full charge. If they're expecting a crippled Predator, they're in for a nasty revelation." Marin Dax, still at weapons control, let out a low breath. "They're not leaving room for mistakes this time." Elias folded his arms, studying the data like a man assembling a puzzle in real time. "They're hedging their bets, expecting an ambush. They know we're unconventional and they're adapting. That's new." Torin's lips curled slightly. Not new enough? The Galactic Concorde had ruled for millennia because it had never been challenged. It moved with the arrogance of absolute dominance, but now cracks had formed in its foundation. Fear was a new variable, and fear made even the most disciplined commanders dangerous. Torin tapped a control, shifting the display to a real-time feed of Earth. The planet sat beneath them, illuminated in a wash of sunlight, clouds casting slow-moving shadows over land masses shaped by war and time, a world that had birthed warriors, survivors. The last place the Concorde should have picked to invade. "Let them come," Torin murmured. Elias arched a brow. "And if they bring more than we can handle?" Torin turned, his gaze unreadable. "Then they'll have more to lose than we will." The Concorde's first wave arrived within the hour. The Black Serpent remained in low orbit, masked by its countermeasures, watching from the shadows. The enemy ships did not approach cautiously. They swept forward in synchronized precision, bristling with armaments, a floating war front of energy cannons and missile platforms. A standard show of force would have been to form a defensive blockade, establish control, send a demand for surrender. But the Concorde had abandoned the script. They fired the first shot. The Black Serpent rolled into motion before the impact even landed, shifting through the dark like a predator slipping through tall grass. The plasma barrage struck empty space, searing streaks of heat through the void, but their target was already gone. Torin barely shifted in his seat as the displays flared with incoming weapons locks. The Concorde's strategy was brute force, a sledgehammer against a blade. "Give them something to react to," he ordered. Marin grinned. "With pleasure." The first railgun round didn't just strike, it cut through a Concorde destroyer like an executioner's axe. The hull split in two, ribbons of fire bursting from the wound, the shockwave rippling across the fleet. The warship didn't explode instantly. It simply came apart, the vacuum claiming it piece by piece. Torin watched without expression. "They'll adapt," Elias muttered, gaze fixed on the tactical feed. "They have to. They can't afford not to." The Concorde forces recalibrated within seconds. They shifted formation, layering shield arrays to compensate for the kinetic threat. The fleet's rear-line ships deployed countermeasures, scrambling for a strategy, but they were still too slow. Torin lifted a hand. Second volley. This time, the slugs tore through shielded vessels as if the defenses were an afterthought. Ships detonated in silent bursts of light, the destruction rippling outward, sending smaller cruisers spinning into the black, debris spiraling like shattered glass. The Concorde's fleet was strong, but it wasn't ready for an enemy that fought with physics instead of firepower. Torin leaned forward slightly. "Commander, send a transmission." Elias gave him a knowing glance. "To who?" Torin's eyes gleamed. "High Command." Minutes later, the transmission connected. The Galactic Concorde's War Council filled the screen, rows of alien leaders, advisors, and Overlord Clythe, his dark gaze gleaming like polished obsidian. Silence stretched between them. No laughter, no mockery, just the heavy weight of realization settling over their faces. Torin didn't smile, didn't taunt. He simply let the wreckage of their fleet burn behind him, a slow-drifting monument to their miscalculation. Clythe's voice, when he finally spoke, was like groundstone. "You believe this skirmish changes anything?" Torin tilted his head. "No." He let the pause drag, just long enough for the tension to settle like a storm waiting to break. "But you do." A flicker of something dangerous passed through Clythe's gaze. "You are outnumbered. Outmatched. Your species has no future among the stars." Torin watched him, measured him. "We were never looking for a future." His voice was quiet. "We were looking for an opportunity." Elias spoke next, tone measured. "Your fleets are adapting. Fast. That's impressive. But your problem isn't tactics." He leaned forward, folding his hands against the display. "Your problem is that your empire is built on the assumption that no one would ever stand against you." Clythe's expression darkened. Torin sat back. "And now we're here." The Concord War Council bristled. The tension coiled like a drawn wire, ready to snap. Clythe leaned forward, his voice a low warning. "You misunderstand your place, Captain. You are an anomaly. One warship does not change the fate of an empire." Torin's lips barely twitched. "Who said there was only one?" The silence that followed was absolute. Clythe did not react outwardly, but Torin saw it, the flicker of uncertainty, the weight of possibility gripping him like cold hands. Torin exhaled slowly. "This isn't a negotiation, Overlord. It's a courtesy. The only one you're getting." The transmission cut to black. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elias let out a slow breath, rubbing his jaw. That should get their attention. Torin watched the burning remains of the Concord fleet through the display, the firelight reflecting in his pupils. "Good." He turned away. "Let's see how desperate they become." The darkness of space had always been an ally to those who knew how to use it. The black serpent drifted in the shadow of a barren moon, waiting, watching. Below, the ruined wreckage of the Concord's fallen fleet still tumbled through the void, remnants of ships that had once crushed entire civilizations, now reduced to drifting husks. Torin Vex stood at the command deck, his hands resting lightly on the cold steel of his chair. His gaze flicked across the heads-up display, absorbing the rapid influx of data streaming from the ship's long-range scanners. The Concord's second wave was coming, but it wasn't an armada this time. It was something far more desperate. "They're deploying ground forces." Elias Corr's voice carried a note of something between amusement and grim satisfaction. He stood beside Torin, his eyes fixed on the tactical readout. Torin exhaled through his nose. "They're still clinging to the old playbook." Marin Dax let out a low chuckle from the weapons console. "They think they're playing a siege. Poor bastards don't realize they're walking into a tomb." The Concord had decided to bypass the fleet battle entirely. They were throwing troops, walkers, and war machines straight onto Earth's surface. No preliminary bombardment, no long-range missile strikes. A full invasion. Torin tapped a control, bringing up a direct topographical feed of Earth. The continent sat beneath shifting cloud cover, veins of light tracing across the land masses where human cities burned against the night. But the Concord wasn't targeting the cities. They were deploying to the wildlands. "They want to take the ground before they take the skies," Elias noted, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "If they can establish planetary control, they'll bottleneck us in orbit." Torin's expression didn't change. "They assume Earth is like any other world they've conquered." Marin smirked. "They're about to find out how wrong they are." The Concord dropships breached the atmosphere in waves. From orbit, they must have thought it was beautiful. Gleaming formations of landing craft breaking through the clouds, their hulls reflecting the flickering storms below. A planetary insertion on a primitive world, a show of dominance. But from the ground, it was something else entirely. The first drop pods smashed into the soil, sinking deep into the thick jungle canopies. The doors burst open, releasing columns of Concord infantry, tall armored figures stepping onto alien terrain, their helmets scanning in all directions. The world felt strange beneath their feet. The air was heavy, thick with moisture that clung to their armor. The ground was not firm and level like their engineered homeworlds. It shifted beneath them, damp and alive. Something chittered in the distance, a sound unlike anything they had catalogued. One of the Concord officers, a veteran of planetary conquests, tilted his head. His visor scanned the region. The biome didn't match any standard war zone models. The gravity was nearly double what they were accustomed to. The atmospheric density was higher than their estimates. Their movement was slower. Their breathing felt wrong. Something wasn't right. Then the ground moved. The first tremor rippled through the jungle like a slow-building drumbeat. Leaves quivered. Water pooled in dense, black mud began to shake. The canopy above twisted and groaned, vines snapping like sinew. A low growl echoed through the valley. One of the Concord troopers froze, his head snapping toward the sound. His weapon shifted, the barrel tracking along the trees. Something watched them. Then everything erupted at once. The earth split. Torrents of churning mud exploded outward as buried seismic charges triggered along the entire drop zone. Tremors cascaded through the valley, cracking trees in half, sending boulders rolling like thrown dice. Entire platoons were swallowed in an instant, their suits useless against the sheer force of shifting tectonic plates. Above, the skies turned to fire. A storm rolled in, not natural, but engineered. High-altitude drones deployed ionized disruptors, triggering localized lightning storms that arced through the descending dropships. Hull plating scorched, engines failed mid-flight, and flaming wreckage rained down in a catastrophic spiral. The Concord's elite legions had expected a battlefield. They had stepped onto a predator's den. One of the commanders gasped for breath, his helmet's filtration system failing as the oxygen content overloaded his lungs. His body felt like it was being crushed. The realization dawned too late. They weren't invading Earth. Earth was devouring them. Back aboard the Black Serpent, Torin watched the heads-up display, his expression unreadable. The enemy forces were crumbling before they had even fully deployed. "They still think they can hold ground?" Marin muttered. "They don't think," Elias replied, eyes flickering over the data stream. "They're reacting, trying to adapt, but they can't." Torin finally spoke. "They built their empire on worlds that welcomed them." His voice was quiet, almost contemplative. "They don't know what it means to fight something that bites back." Elias glanced at him. "They're sending reinforcements, ground-based combat walkers, air support. They're not giving up." "They still believe numbers are enough," Torin mused. "Let them believe it." Jackson Holt's voice cut in from engineering. "Captain, the secondary charges are in position. If we trigger them now, we can bury half their forces under 6 meters of rock and fire." Torin considered. "Not yet. We let them think they have a chance first." Elias smirked. "You enjoy this too much?" Torin's lips twitched slightly. "I enjoy efficiency." Marin let out a quiet exhale. "Damn, that's cruel." Torin glanced back at the burning swath of jungle, the distant glow of collapsing fortifications as the Concord forces scrambled in blind panic. He saw the desperation in their movements, the slow, creeping realization that they had been lured into a killing ground, and he waited. Because the most effective weapon wasn't just overwhelming force, it was hope, given just long enough to be shattered. "Hold fire," he ordered. "Let them dig in. Let them call for reinforcements. Let them believe this is salvageable." Elias folded his arms. "And then," Torin exhaled slowly, "then we introduce them to the real fight." Below, the jungle burned, And the Concord legions, for the first time in centuries, knew what it meant to be afraid. They still think they can hold the ground. Elias Corr stood beside Torin Vex on the Black Serpent's command deck, watching the laser plasma displays flood with real-time battlefield data. Below them, the Concord's war machines staggered across Earth's surface, their once flawless formations now nothing more than scattered pockets of resistance. Smoke spiraled from shattered walkers, the ground littered with the wreckage of armored dropships that had fallen from the sky like crippled birds. The terrain had swallowed them whole, and what the land didn't crush, the firestorm of orbital bombardments, had finished. Torin tapped a control, zooming in on the remaining strongholds. Bunkers of reinforced alloy, conquered sigils still glimmering defiantly against the blaze. They had dug in, desperate to claw back some semblance of control, but control had never been theirs to begin with. Marin Dax leaned back in his chair at weapons control, expression dry. They're reinforcing the southern perimeter. Smart. If we were planning a siege. Torin let his gaze settle on the crumbling fortifications. They were stalling. He exhaled. Open a channel. A second later, the display shifted. Overlord Clythe's image flickered into existence. Even through the distorted feed, Torin could see the tension carved into the alien's features. The smug arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something coiled and raw, something teetering on the edge of realization. You misunderstand what's happening here, Captain Vex, Clythe began, voice measured but strained. Your victory is an illusion. You cannot win a war against an empire that spans thousands of systems. Torin tilted his head slightly, watching him. And yet, he said, here you are. Clythe's mandibles twitched. We are prepared to negotiate a ceasefire. Elias let out a quiet breath beside Torin. Ceasefire. It was the first time the word had been spoken. That alone was a victory sharper than any weapon. Torin stepped forward, letting the feed adjust as the glow of burning fortifications reflected against his face. Let me make something clear, Overlord, he said. You are not negotiating a ceasefire. Clythe stiffened. You are negotiating your surrender. The chamber behind Clythe erupted into protests, alien voices snapping in dozens of dialects, advisors arguing, shouting, some stepping forward to cut the transmission entirely. But Clythe didn't move. His pupils contracted, dark and thin as a blade. We will not kneel to a species that should have never left its gravity well, he hissed. Torin gave a small nod, as if he'd expected this. Then you won't kneel. He held Clythe's gaze, voice quiet but unwavering. You'll burn. The words landed like a blade sliding between ribs. Clythe stilled, his throat clicking in some unreadable emotion. Torin let the silence stretch before speaking again. Your fleet is shattered. Your armies are scattered across a planet they were never built to survive. You will lose every hour that passes. You will lose every stronghold you cling to. And when this is over, the only thing left of the galactic concord will be the echoes of its mistakes. Clythe's hands curled into fists. We have already lost, Torin finished for him. For the first time, Clythe said nothing. A slow, creeping dread settled into the Overlord's posture, as if the weight of reality had finally begun to break him. Torin exhaled, not unkindly. I am not offering you peace, Clythe. His voice carried the weight of finality. I am offering you survival. Take it while it still exists. The transmission cut. For a moment, the command deck held its breath. Then Elias let out a slow chuckle, rubbing his temple. That went well. Torin turned, eyes flickering toward the main display. The Concord's remaining forces had ceased their counteroffensive. Their movements had shifted from aggression to desperation. Marin glanced up from his console. What now? Torin's lips barely twitched. "Now," he said, "we show them what surrender really looks like." The final assault wasn't a battle. It was surgical, methodical. Concord strongholds collapsed like sand castles beneath a rising tide. Their last war machines sputtered, failing against the weight of a world that refused to be conquered. The ground itself turned against them. Mudslides swallowing fortifications, gravitational shifts pulling walkers into deep crevices. The last holdout fell within the hour, and then there was nothing left to fight. The Black Serpent hovered over the ruins, its shadow stretching over the war-torn battlefield below. Torin stood at the viewport, arms folded behind his back. Elias joined him. "It's done." Torin didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the transmission beacon that had just activated. The Concorde had sent a single final signal. "And now?" Elias asked. Torin watched the beacon pulse, watched the last remnants of an empire realize that history had changed. He exhaled. "Now," he said, "we rewrite the galaxy." The laser plasma display pulsed with the Concorde's final transmission, a beacon flickering in the silence like a dying heartbeat. Surrender. A word they had never spoken before. A concept they had never entertained. Torin Vex stood in the dim glow of the command deck, the weight of victory pressing into the space around him. It wasn't triumph, not yet. The battlefield had gone quiet, but quiet did not mean safe. The remnants of the Concorde's shattered empire still existed, still breathed in the dark corners of the galaxy, waiting to lash out in desperation. Elias Core stepped forward, his sharp gaze tracing the data streams flowing across the heads-up display. "They're transmitting directly from High Command, the Overlord himself. If I had to guess, I'd say he's finally ready to talk." Torin exhaled through his nose, watching the encrypted signal hold steady. "Ready?" But he's out of options." Marin Dax adjusted the interference dampeners, ensuring the transmission wouldn't be traced back to Earth's fleet movements. "If this is a trap, they're playing a damn dangerous game." "Not a trap," Torin murmured. "A test. They want to see if we're like them, if we gloat, if we hesitate." He turned toward Elias. "Open the channel." The display shifted, resolving into the dimly lit war chamber of the Concorde's inner sanctum. Overlord Clythe sat at the head of a long, angular table, his advisors lined in tight rows beside him. The once proud leader of the most dominant empire in the galaxy looked diminished, his posture rigid, his gaze carrying the weight of realization. The Concorde's War Council had been reduced to survivors. "Captain Vex." Clythe's voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "It seems we find ourselves at an impasse." Torin studied him, unblinking. "There is no impasse. There is only your choice, and time is running out." A flicker of something crossed Clythe's face. Not fear, calculations. Even on the edge of ruin, the Overlord was weighing possibilities, searching for leverage where none remained. "You would have us kneel," he said slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "A civilization older than your entire species, a legacy built over millennia." Torin's tone didn't change. "Legacies mean nothing when the present is burning." One of the Concorde advisors, a thin, sharp-eyed figure draped in flowing ceremonial cloth, leaned forward. His voice carried a thread of venom beneath its carefully measured tone. "Do you truly believe you can rule what you do not understand? You are an anomaly, Captain. A single warship does not make a lasting empire. It makes a mistake that will eventually be corrected." Elias gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "That's adorable. They still think this is about a single warship." Torin's gaze never wavered. "We are not an anomaly," he said. "We are the consequence of your arrogance. The galaxy does not belong to those who came first. It belongs to those who are willing to take it." Clythe's jaw tightened. And if we refuse your terms? Torin leaned in slightly. Then you'll learn what it feels like to be hunted. Silence fell over the war chamber. The threat wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The wreckage of the Concorde's fleets already spoke louder than any declaration. Clythe exhaled slowly, his mandibles shifting. For the first time, he looked tired. What do you want? Torin straightened, stepping back into the shadows of the command deck. You already know the answer. Clythe's gaze dropped to the table in front of him. His hands curled slightly. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he pressed a single command into the display. A confirmation signal rippled across the screen. The surrender was official. The Black Serpent's bridge remained silent. Even Marin, who always had something to say, simply let out a low breath. Elias finally spoke, voice low. It's done. Torin turned from the display, his thoughts already moving ahead. The war was over, but wars didn't simply end. They bled into the next conflict, into the next struggle for control. And control was what mattered now. The surrender of the conquered was not a quiet event. Surviving stronghold, every planetary governor, every remnant fleet still lingering on the edges of the empire. Some sectors accepted the inevitable. Their leaders sent messages of compliance, prepared to negotiate their place in the new order. Others refused, digging in, believing the surrender was a temporary setback. Torin stood at the edge of the command deck, watching as data streamed in. Patterns were forming, resistance pockets, last-ditch strongholds. The conquered had fallen, but some still thought they could carve a future from its corpse. Elias approached, his gaze flicking over the latest transmissions. They won't all fall in line. Torin nodded. Some will fight, some will run, some will try to reshape the ruins into something new. He let the thought settle before adding, but they all have one thing in common. Elias arched a brow. And that is... Torin's gaze flickered with something unreadable. They're afraid. The first act of the new order was not a declaration of rule. It was a demonstration. A single remnant Concorde fleet, led by a surviving admiral who had refused to acknowledge the surrender, rallied near the core systems, attempting to regroup. A final act of defiance. Torin gave the order. The Black Serpent did not attack. It erased them. A coordinated strike, railguns lancing through warships like spears through flesh, drop pods breaching hulls before detonating within, combat teams moving like shadows through corridors, wiping out entire command structures before the enemy had time to react. Within 17 minutes, the fleet was gone. The message was clear. The galaxy had changed, and those who did not accept it would not live to see its future. Back on the command deck, Torin watched the last remnants of the resistance flicker and die on the laser plasma display. Elias exhaled, rubbing his jaw. That should keep the rest of them in line, for now. Torin didn't answer. His gaze had shifted to something else. A new transmission, encrypted, isolated from the surrender channels. A beacon from deep space. Elias followed his gaze. That's not Concord. No. Torin accessed the data feed, his fingers gliding over the controls. The signal was ancient, but familiar in a way that set something deep in his gut on edge. A single phrase pulsed in the transmission logs. They are watching. A chill crept into the space between them. Marin frowned, glancing between them. Who the hell is they? Torin stared at the transmission, the glow of the display reflecting in his eyes. We're about to find out. Torin Vex stood before the laser plasma display, his gaze locked on the encrypted transmission. It pulsed in irregular intervals, a faint signal buried under layers of interference, as if whoever had sent it didn't want to be found, or didn't want to be traced. Elias Core studied the data with a slight frown. We cracked the encryption, but there's no origin point, no sender. Just the message. Torin didn't need to read it again. They are watching. Marin Dax leaned against the weapons console, arms crossed. You think it's conquered remnants trying to act mysterious? Maybe some warlord looking to take Clythe's place? Elias shook his head. If that were the case, they'd be making demands. This is something else. Torin exhaled slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the console. It doesn't change our next step. The war is over. But control isn't established through victory alone. It's built through what comes after. He turned away from the display, the weight of the moment pressing against his shoulders. We need a strategy. The Black Serpent's war room was silent, except for the faint hum of tactical data scrolling across the heads-up displays. Every officer stood in place, waiting. This wasn't a battlefield, not in the traditional sense, but in this room, wars were decided before a single shot was fired. Torin stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. We need to assume that surrender isn't enough to keep the Concord in check. Their fleets are in disarray, their leaders fractured, but not broken. We don't give them the chance to recover. Elias nodded. We dismantle them sector by sector. Torin tapped a command on the console, bringing up a tactical overlay of the Concord's remaining strongholds. Red-marked systems blinked across the galaxy, indicating remnants that hadn't yet declared loyalty. Their outer colonies are crumbling. Civil unrest is spreading through their core worlds. We accelerate the collapse before someone else decides to take control, Elias continued. Jackson Holt, standing by the logistics display, let out a low breath. Dismantling an empire isn't the same as conquering it. If we leave power vacuums, someone worse takes their place. Torin's voice was calm, measured. Which is why we're not just breaking them, we're replacing them. A ripple of silence passed over the room. Marin let out a dry chuckle. That's ambitious. Elias glanced at Torin. You don't mean occupation. No, Torin said. I mean control. He gestured to the data feeds flickering with incoming transmissions, requests for negotiations, civil uprisings, governors pledging fealty before they even received an ultimatum. They're looking for stability. We give it to them, on our terms. Jackson folded his arms. We're turning Earth into the new Concord. Torin met his gaze without hesitation. Not Concord. His voice was steady. Something better. The next 24 hours were not spent in battle. They were spent in systematic dismantling. The Concord's remaining warlords attempted to consolidate power. Torin gave the order to erase them, not through brute force. That wasn't necessary anymore. Instead, supply chains were severed. Key infrastructure was dismantled before they could even react. Governors who once pledged loyalty to Clythe were offered a choice, fall in line or fall entirely. One by one, they submitted. The core worlds of the Concord collapsed inward. Without the fleets to enforce their rule, their economic systems failed. Entire colonies declared neutrality. Others began to rewrite their own laws, casting off the chains of an empire that had ruled them for generations. And through it all, Earth remained silent. It didn't rush to claim the throne. It simply waited until the moment came when the galaxy turned toward the Black Serpent, not in fear, but in expectation. That was the true victory. Not everyone accepted the new order. The last surviving admirals of the Concord had fled into hiding, gathering in the deep fringes of space where the Empire's final warships remained. They were fractured, disorganized, but they were still dangerous. Torin studied the intel reports from the intercepted transmissions. They're planning something. Elias's gaze flicked to the display. A last stand? Torin shook his head. Number. They know they can't fight us, but they can destroy what comes next. The final remnants of the Concord weren't aiming for victory. They were aiming for revenge, a desperate plan, one that wouldn't win the war, but could destabilize everything. Marin exhaled. Then we cut off their hands before they can strike. Torin's gaze darkened. We find them first. The black serpent moved through deep space like a phantom, its trajectory masked, its presence unannounced. It wasn't hunting a fleet. It was hunting an idea. A single transmission had given away the Concorde's last stronghold, a hidden station on the edge of a dying star, a place where the old warlords had gathered in secrecy. Torin stood at the deployment bay, watching as the final teams loaded into their assault craft. They weren't launching an attack. They were executing the last move on the board. Elias stepped beside him, adjusting his armor. "This is it, then." Torin's voice was quiet. This is the beginning." Elias let out a slow breath, then nodded. "See you on the other side?" The boarding pods launched, cutting through the void in streaks of silver, descending toward the last remnants of an empire that no longer existed. The boarding pods breached the station's outer shell like fangs sinking into flesh. Atmosphere vented through fractured bulkheads, bodies were torn from corridors into the abyss, and alarms wailed through the dying station's skeletal corridors. The last remnants of the Concorde's warlords had gathered here, thinking they could disappear into the dark. They had forgotten. Monsters didn't hide in the dark. They ruled it. Torin Vex stepped through the breach, his boots meeting steel slick with oil and blood. The air was dense with burning insulation, the harsh sting of ruptured life support. The war was supposed to be over. But the war had never been about the Concorde. It had been about control. And until that was absolute, it wasn't over. Gunfire cracked ahead, muffled by the thick walls of the war room. Elias Core moved beside him, his rifle low, his expression carved from stone. "They're cornered, fighting to make the end look honorable." He glanced at Torin, voice laced with dry amusement. "Let them have it." Torin stepped over the body of a fallen Concorde officer, barely sparing it a glance. "We don't grant honor where none was earned." The doors ahead burst open. 2 surviving warlords were dragged into the corridor by his men, their once immaculate armor scorched and fractured. The taller of the 2, a reptilian commander with slitted eyes, spat blood onto the floor, his breathing shallow. "You think killing us will erase the Concorde?" Torin didn't answer immediately. He watched them, the way their shoulders shook, not with defiance, but with the creeping realization that their story had already ended. The Concord wasn't a power anymore. It was a memory waiting to be forgotten. "You don't get it," Elias said, crouching beside one of them. His voice was calm, conversational. "We're not erasing the Concord." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "We're replacing it." The reptilian's throat clicked. Fear slid behind his eyes. Torin took a slow step forward, his shadow casting long over the 2 kneeling figures. "There's no monument to failure in history," he said evenly. "Only the stories of the ones who came after. You had your time. You wasted it." He turned his gaze to Elias. "End this." The gunshots were quick, clean, final. Torin didn't watch them fall. He was already moving. The war was over. But the galaxy hadn't stopped watching. The black serpent hovered in the dark, its presence no longer a whisper, but a declaration. The surrender of the Concorde had sent shockwaves through every empire, every world, even those untouched by the war. And now the question hung in the void, unspoken but understood. Who ruled now? Torin stood at the center of the command deck, the laser plasma displays casting his face in shifting blue light. Elias exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "The core systems are stabilizing under new leadership. Every governor that mattered has either pledged loyalty or disappeared trying to resist." He flicked a glance toward Torin. "We own this now." Marin Dax, leaning against the weapons console, gave a humorless chuckle. "Still think it's a bad idea?" Elias smirked. "Oh, it's a terrible idea." But it's the only one that works. Torin remained silent for a moment, eyes locked on the sector map before him. The Conquered was gone, but something else had risen in its place. Not an empire, not a dictatorship. Something sharper, smarter. A force that didn't rule through tradition, but through the simple, undeniable truth that nothing could stop them. He tapped a command. A new transmission had come through. Encrypted. Deep space origin. The same frequency as before. Elias straightened. That signal again? Torin opened the file. The message was short. 3 words. We are coming. The bridge fell silent. Marin let out a slow breath. Well, that's ominous. Torin studied the message, his fingers flexing once against the console. They had expected resistance. They had expected rebellions. But this was something else. Elias met his gaze. Orders? Torin exhaled. Then he smiled. Let them come. The Black Serpent turned toward the unknown. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. Target locked. Now, hit it, before they realize. The command rang out through the war room, harsh and clear. Darian Hesseck's fingers moved in practiced precision across the console, his eyes never leaving the laser plasma display in front of him. The faint pulse of light from the screen was reflected in his cold, focused eyes as the enemy fleet's coordinates blinked before him. The tension was palpable, thick like smoke in the room. The hum of the terminal was drowned out by the roar of commandos scrambling in the distance, their boots pounding the metal floors of the underground facility. Hesseck was a strategist, a mind that lived in the gray area between war and diplomacy, between destruction and negotiation. But right now, there was no room for compromise. The hegemony had underestimated Earth for the last time. The war was not just inevitable, it was already in motion. A low whine filled the room as the ships carrying the first wave of Earth's response powered up, their systems syncing with the hidden codes Hesseck had long planted in the hegemony's communications. Beneath the calculated chaos, a cold certainty ran through him. Earth's resistance was about to be seen, not as a fleeting flare, but as a sustained, systematic assault. Target destroyed, a voice confirmed, the words echoed by the relieved exhale of the crew around him. Good, Hesseck said, his voice measured but heavy with intent. Keep your eyes open. This is just the beginning. The hum of the room grew as the next set of commands went through, the atmosphere thickening with each second. But there was no sign of panic on Hesseck's face, only an eerie calm. Around him, the officers worked with focused urgency, coordinating the next phase, making sure the operation stayed on track. The subtlety of the plan was its strength. The hegemony would be left unaware, caught in a web of manipulation and surprise. Across the galaxy, the reaction from Earth was far quieter than its enemies expected. Rorden Helix, seated in his private, dimly lit command center, had no time for celebratory moments. His fingers moved over the holographic interface, manipulating strings of data as easily as breathing. He had already begun the silent takeover, undetectable, meticulous. Every transmission, every encrypted signal that flowed across the vast expanse of space was now tainted with Earth's touch. Earth wasn't just responding to an extinction order, it was positioning itself as the unseen hand, pulling the strings of the very technology the hegemony had relied on for centuries. The glow from the screen was harsh against his tired face. He had not slept in days, but fatigue wasn't a luxury he could afford. Earth's survival was too critical. The trade routes were being subtly altered, key messages were being intercepted and redirected, and the systems once thought secure were now riddled with Earth's fingerprints. Back on Earth, in one of the top military command centers, Bren Zarin stood over a table cluttered with digital maps and war schematics. His brow furrowed as he reviewed the deployment schedules for Earth's colonies, all silently shifting into battle readiness. Every station is in place, Zarin confirmed with a steady voice, but there was a noticeable edge to it. No one will suspect anything. The infrastructure disguised as civilian settlements is solid. We can hold for longer than they think. Beside him, a junior officer adjusted his headset, reading off the latest report. Colonial shields are online. We're integrating their defenses into the main fleet's systems. If the hegemony strikes, they won't know where it came from. Zarin nodded sharply. It'll be their last mistake. Make sure every piece is locked in place. The next phase starts with them thinking we've rolled over. They'll be wrong.